There is something intangible about the places we gather. Over time, the walls of those places come to hold not just their inhabitants, but a kind of collective spirit, what historians might call collective memory, a way for people to relate, share, and remember their identity and their history. In a small town outside Halifax, Nova Scotia in 2011, a church was built in an attempt to be an exact replica of a church that once stood in the same spot over 40 years prior. But despite its architectural resemblance, this new church was empty of the collective memory that had filled its predecessor for over 100 years. Instead, it carried a new memory, that of racism, discrimination, and displacement. A memory of the town of Africville, which began as a settlement of newly free African Nova Scotians and persevered against all odds, and of Seaview African United Baptist Church that became the heart and soul of the town until one night the government bulldozed it down. After the American Revolution and the War of 1812, large groups of black settlers began coming to Nova Scotia, having been promised land and freedom. In most cases, that was technically true. However, because of racism, new black settlers were pushed to the fringes, forced to found new settlements on the most barren and undesirable tracts of land. One of those settlements was Africville, a small community founded on the outskirts of Halifax in 1836.
We all live in our own homes out here, detached homes, where our children can run around.
Africville existed in a strange limbo. The community was never really officially established. It was part of Richmond, but Halifax acted like it didn't exist. The town never received proper roads, health services, clean water, sewage treatments, street lamps, or electricity. Well contamination was so prominent that residents had to boil their water before cooking or drinking. Social services were just as bad. Up until 1933, Africville had never had a properly trained teacher. But due to rampant poverty, many parents had to keep their kids home from school anyways, so they could work or look after the other children. In Africville's first elementary school, of the 140 students registered, only 60 of them reached grade 7, and only 5 ever made it to grade 10. This was exacerbated by the fact that Halifax used Africville like a dumping ground, both literally and figuratively, for undesirable facilities. In 1958, they moved the landfill to Africville.
Where the pavement ended, Africville began. And where Africville ended, the city dump began.
I think the majority of the people from Africville felt the dump was a blessing, because through the dump, we were able to get the materials that we couldn't afford to buy.
It was sometime around Christmas when we picked up a newspaper. And in it was the story of a family in Africville that had been burning old car batteries which had been scavenged on the dump to keep them warm. And as a result of burning those batteries, the family was lead poisoned and had to be taken to the hospital. And I asked myself the question, God, what is this?
One bright spot of the community was the church. The church was the center of social life, the place of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. Other groups from across the area came to the church for Sunday picnics. What Africville lacked in amenities, it made up for in community. Yet, in spite of over a century of history, everything was about to change. The end of the 40s and into the 50s saw the post-war boom in Canada. Governments across the country began to enter a new stage of urban renewal. The sentiment spread across the country that people living in areas designated as slums could be relocated to improved housing.
They call this place a slum. It is. And who made it like that? The city is the cause of all of it.
Halifax City Council voted unanimously to adopt the relocation proposal. The relocation began in 1964.
The disappearance of Africville in the 1960s was attributed to urban renewal. It was a program which included wholesale rehousing and swept across Europe and North America. Urban renewal was intended to make things better and displace hundreds of thousands on both continents. Ultimately, it was clear it was a failure.
In a very real sense, the black people in the wider community of our province were not sensitive enough to unite, to come together, and to fight this blatant denial of people's human rights. That you could not think, that you could not make decisions, that we do all your decision making for you. And that was what happened in Africville. They went through the exercise of having meetings with the people there, but behind it all, decisions had already been made. That was prime land. That was important land. That this kind of land was not for the black people.
The city began approaching residents of Africville with offers to buy their homes. The problem was many of the residents of Africville lived in homes built by their ancestors. They had no deed, no paperwork of any kind proving that they owned the home. They never needed any. Out of all the residents of Africville, only 14 had clear legal title. For those without paperwork, the city offered $500, about $5,000 adjusted for inflation today, and promises of future allowances.
I remember the city saying to these people, if you're not over there by the time the bulldozer gets finished with one home, then your home will be bulldozed over. You won't give the $500, you won't get the $500 the city is promising to give people. You won't get a home for a home, and we won't help you.
I remember trucks coming in. I remember Mrs. Mountley's house. Tore it down, never took a stitch of furniture, gave her time to take a stitch of furniture, order a home, and knocked it down. They bulldozed it. Mr. James's store was in the hospital, Campbell Hospital, and they bulldozed his house down. The man didn't even know. He come out of the hospital and had no place to go.
And I remember my son coming home one night and he said, Mom, he said, the church is gone. This is about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, young people being out. And I said, oh, no. I said, it can't be. I said, it can't be. I said, no, Mom. He said, it's flat to the ground.
Still inside the church were vital records of birth, marriage, and death certificates that could have been used to establish chain of custody for land claims. Why were those documents still inside the church? After all, an official document shows that the city purchased the church in 1967, and based on their past history, the residents must have known the church was due to be demolished at any moment. The truth is, the city did not gain control of the church until 1968, and government officials doctored the documents to make it appear that demolishing the church was done lawfully. The last home in Africville was demolished on the 2nd of January 1970, but the destruction of the church was the unofficial end of the community.
They took our homes, they moved us out of Africville in the city garbage trucks. We had a lot better out there than some places they put us in this city. We haven't even got enough to put down one payment for a home. Nothing. I'm living on welfare. I think a whole lot of us, when we came in this city, we had to go on welfare. When we lived in that city of Africville, you look in the records and see how many Africville people had to humble and come to the city for welfare. We were too independent. We didn't want it. We earned our own living, and we earned it the honest way. Our boys never had so much trouble until they came in the city.
The city had lofty promises, but they did not come to fruition. In general, relocated residents had a higher cost of living and a higher unemployment rate. The government promised employment and education programs, but they were never implemented. Residents were relocated to community housing and promised social supports, but within 3 years, the city ended all social assistance programs designed to help the residents of Africville.
When you're in this country and you own a piece of property, you're not a second-class citizen. That's why my people own this land. They work for it, they toil for it, and they work to get this little piece of land that they own, and they try to hang on it. But when your land is being taken away from you and you ain't offered nothing, then you become a peasant in any man's country.
The spot where Africville stood also never lived up to the potential promised by the city. A highway was put through part of it, but surviving residents of Africville and their children never stopped protesting. As a result of the continued backlash in the 80s, the land where houses once stood and families made a life for themselves became a memorial park, preventing it from being developed. In 2002, Halifax Mayor Peter Kelly offered some money and land services to create a replica of the Seaview African United Baptist Church, and the site that once held Africville became a historic site that year. 8 years later, in 2010, Halifax offered an official apology as part of a $4.5 million compensation deal that included the church replica and a heritage museum.
On behalf of the Halifax Regional Municipality, I apologize to the former Africville residents and their descendants for what they have endured for almost 50 years. Ever since the loss of your community, which stood on the shores of Bedford Basin for some 150 years. You lost your homes, your church, all the places in which you gathered with your family and friends to share and mark the milestones of your lives. For all of that, we apologize. We realize words cannot undo what has been done, but we are profoundly sorry and apologize to each and every one of you. Our history cannot be rewritten, but thankfully, the future is a blank page. And starting today, we hold the pen which we can write a shared tomorrow. It is in that spirit of respect and reconciliation that we ask for your forgiveness.
It's one of the nicest little communities I ever lived in. And to tell you something, I've been around this world twice. I've never met a place like Africville. Never.
But Mr. Steed, everybody thought it was such a bad place.
Who?
All the people who tore it down.
Oh, the people that tore it down. That's the people that tore it down, the city of Halifax, the authorities of the city of Halifax.
They said it was a bad place.
That's what they called it. But it was not to us, it was a heaven, a home, a real home.